How's everybody doing today? You're watching Slot Car Mayhem. I'm John, and this will be episode 20 of the Glendale 65. And today we're going to talk about structure lighting and the rabbit hole that we're going to have to climb down to make sure that we achieve a realistic level of lighting within our structures. That being said, first off, I hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving. It's currently now the day after Thanksgiving 2020, and instead of being out there shopping, buying a bunch of stuff, I'd rather spend my time with you fine folks. So here I am knocking a video out. Hopefully I can get another one out this weekend as well, so that should be good. Once again, hope everybody had a wonderful Thanksgiving, everybody was safe, and everybody really enjoyed themselves. It's a great time of the year. Okay, let's go ahead and get ready to jump down this rabbit hole. One thing we do want to pay attention to, and we do need to understand, is if you're doing a relaxed type of layout and you want to throw some structures on your layout and you want to stick some lights in there, by all means knock yourself out. You're perfectly fine doing that. This is not to indicate that you're doing anything poorly. This is more geared towards those who are going to do more of a high scenic type of layout, and you want to capture that element of realism into lighting your structures. And we'll take a look at some examples of what we see in the real world and how we can apply them into a model world. So let's go ahead and let's get started. Okay, let's begin by going through some guidelines. And out of all the guidelines that I have, the first one actually is a list of rules. These are more specifically don'ts, I guess, if you want to look at it that way. These can really damage a otherwise well executed scene, and we want to make sure that we avoid these at all costs. So my first rule is use all means necessary to eliminate any unrealistic lighting artifacts or scenarios. What do I mean by that? Well, let's take a look at one that's very common. You see more often than not, generally from more unexperienced modelers, and that's light leaks. What's a light leak? You have two walls that join, you've got a joint. The joint is not perfect, and when you light the structure, all of a sudden now you see that crack, you see light pouring through that crack. Another scenario where it's actually very common, if you have a removable roof section, which most of us probably will at one point or another, that's not sealed off properly, and you get lighting spilling out, showing through the cracks where the roof would come off, and that in itself can very easily damage a scene, taking a well executed scene and reducing it down in its level of realism. One that me in particular is going to have to pay very close attention to on this particular layout, it has to be with light leaks between the walls and the terrain itself. I'm not going to have platforms or bases that my structures are going to be sitting on. They're going to be sitting directly, the walls go directly right on the surface with no base. And so I need to make sure that there's no light leaks coming from the walls spilling out onto the terrain, because that in itself can also damage a scene. It's very unrealistic and the eye catches it very quickly. And basically it can take a well executed scene almost into toy-like status at that point. So those are some of the things that we want to avoid. Some other ones, a very common way of lighting structures on railroads, where you have a lot of structures and they're all going to be lit. A lot of people would use Christmas lights, little white lights, you know what I'm talking about. And they would just simply drill a hole in their layout and they would feed the light up underneath, and then they'd set the structure down on top. And if you've got a structure with a big storefront and you're lighting it that way, you're going to see your bulb right there as you casually look at the front of the building, and through all that glass you're going to see that bulb sticking up. And direct visibility of your point light source can be very damaging to a scene, and it's something that once you see, you can't unsee. You'll always see it. The eye is drawn towards a light, especially a point light source, and that can do a lot of damage to a scene in itself. So be very mindful of that. You're better off lighting your structures on the ceiling and letting the light filter down. And if you use several small point light sources instead of one big one, If by chance somebody does happen to get low enough that they can see the ceiling lights inside, it'll look like an array of ceiling lights inside the structure, and it will immediately make sense and nobody will pay it any further thought, but it won't be directly visible from casual observation. Another one that is pretty common is overlighting a structure, and that can be pretty intense, and we'll break into some of that, and I'll show you why you can lose a lot of realism and effectiveness by doing so as we progress further into this episode. So you got to be very careful about overdriving the brightness of your structures, and it's something that's very common that people tend to do. And again, if you're trying to achieve an element of realism, we're going to lose the actual artifacts we're trying to capture by doing this if we overdrive our lights, and I'll show you some examples of that. Another thing is failure to light something that should be illuminated, or lighting something that probably should not. That is kind of up to you, but if you've got certain types of scenarios, certain things probably should be illuminated. If you don't illuminate them, it's going to stand out and it's going to be noticeable. So we got a handful of things that we really want to work around. We want to make sure we don't overdrive our lighting. We want to make sure that we don't have any light leaks or artifacts like glowing walls or hot spots. That's also very common. On smaller scales where you have thinner plastic walls, if you put too bright of a light in there, the building itself will actually glow because the plastic is relatively translucent. And that's something you got to make sure you avoid. All these little things can really diminish a scene as far as realism, and these are things that we need to make sure that we're avoiding at all costs. Okay, let's talk about our structures themselves, and what we're going to do is we're going to break down our structures into two specific classes. I don't like to break them down into subsets. I find no reason to do so. But looking at our structures as a whole, what we have is we have commercial structures and we have residential structures. Any further breakdown is pretty much unnecessary because you have the flexibility to do what you want with those lower structured categories. Residential and commercial, those are your two primaries, and they each behave very differently. So we'll go ahead and we'll break down commercial structures first, and we'll show you how we probably should try to present these in daylight scenarios, nighttime scenarios, and let's take a look and see what we actually have and what we want to try to achieve if we want more realistic type of lighting into our elements. Okay, first things first, let's go ahead and take a look at some commercial structures. I'm going to pull my screen up over here and we'll take a look and see what we have. And I'm going to go ahead and let's take a look at some files here. And I've got a collection of pictures I found across the web looking at different things, showing different scenarios. So let's take a look at a picture here that we have. This is a basic building, basic commercial building. And it's probably pretty reminiscent of something you'd find in a regular model railroad layout. It's not directly supported by anything. It's more of a straight scenic element, but it is a commercial building. And one of the rules of a commercial building is a commercial building should always be lit as long as the business is open for business. If it's open, the interior is going to be illuminated. Very simple. You don't walk into a restaurant or a bar or anything else where the interior lights are off, even if it's noon. The interior lights are going to be on in any business you're going to walk into, and this is no exception. So we look at this business, it's daytime, the business is open. If we look at the window here, we can tell it's open. If you zoom in a little bit and look a little closer, you can see that elements here, you can actually see things on the shelf. Furthermore, we can gather the type of light. It looks to be about the color temperature of maybe fluorescent, so this is probably lit with fluorescent lighting. And it looks exactly the way we would expect it to look. If we look on the other side, this is actually the same business. And my guess is this is the restaurant side of the business, and that's probably closed. You can see it looks very dark in comparison And yes, they have a grate over the window, a security grate, but it also looks like the lighting is completely off. We don't see any evidence of it being illuminated on the inside. So my guess is that the building is closed. That's why I like this picture. It shows the building being open and closed during daylight hours. And as you can tell, the lighting itself is very subdued. We don't see 10 gallons of light pouring out of the windows here, even though the building is open and illuminated. One thing that is missing, I would say it's missing, even though this is a real life picture, is I don't see an open sign on here. And in this case, something like an illuminated open sign can go a long way to further enhance that illusion that the building is in fact open for business and that it is illuminated on the inside. Now, that being said, if we notice, like I said, we don't see tons of light pouring out and flooding the area. So what's exactly going on here? Something we need to pay attention to is the fact that if we go back to the last episode where I talked about compression and selective compression and how the world itself has shrunk down, likewise in the same thought process, sunlight itself is very compressed when we're bringing it into the model world. And what I mean by that is the lighting that we're using to emulate sunlight in our room over the layout is nowhere, not even close, as intense as actual sunlight. So we need to make sure that the lighting in our structures are brought down to a level that will match what we're trying to achieve with your structures. And to give you an idea how compressed things actually are in real life, if you took a regular nice bright sunny day and then you also compared that with night, what you would see at night in the real world, and you put that on a scale, let's call it a scale 1 to 10, and 1 being night, 10 being bright day at noon, let's say, and you bring that down into the model world, when you consider the fact that under nighttime conditions, I'm going to have a big screen here nearby that's going to be providing some lighting. Throughout other areas of the room, there may be some additional small lighting, also providing some additional lighting. And so you put that in perspective, and then you consider the fact that the lighting I'm using for daylight is nowhere near as intense as actual sunlight. And we take that same thought process of that scale from 1 to 10 being the real world, and we compress that down. And best case scenario, you're probably going to be looking at a scale of 1 to 3. In my case, it's going to be more like 1 to 2. And we need to make sure that the lighting inside our structures during daylight conditions are applicable and they look to be balanced as the way we would expect to see them in the real world. So what exactly are we looking at, and how do we know we've achieved the correct or the approximation of the correct amount of lighting inside the structure? Again, if we look inside, we can see items inside the store are illuminated, indicating it's not a deep dark hole. But also, if we look at our glass itself, you can see highlights and reflections and some contrast between the two of elements that are being lit up by sunlight being reflected off of our glass fronts on our store. That's the illusion we're going after. That's what we want to try to capture. And the easiest way to do that is to make sure you don't over illuminate your interior structures in regards to daylight. Now, if we go over to this other side over here, you can look right here. I don't know if you can see it on camera or not, but I can see it here where I'm looking. We got a light spot right across here, and we've got some other little artifacts right here, and these are also reflections. They're much more subdued because there's a security grate over the window, so those reflections are greatly subdued at this point, but we still see some trace of reflections even off this big window over here. But directly here, where the angle is a little bit different, you can clearly see these reflections. And once again, that's exactly what we're trying to capture, and that's what we want to get off of our storefronts with the glass windows is these particular highlights. That being said, the important takeaway here in this particular case is if you are unable to achieve a satisfactory level of lighting on your structures for daylight operation, you're better off not illuminating the structure at all. And because that's going to make sure that you still have these contrasts and these reflections that are actually what we're going for. This is the look we want right here. And if we eliminate those under daylight conditions, it's going to greatly reduce the realism of what we're trying to do and the effect we're trying to achieve. Okay, let's take a look at another commercial building in bright daylight, and this further shows what I mean about the interior lighting of a structure, how it looks very dark compared to the real world. And here we've got, as we can see, it's a Jiffy Lube, it's a bright sunny day, and you can clearly see that the bays themselves are relatively dark compared to your ambient lighting, which is daylight. But from the angle of the picture, we can clearly see the ceiling lights indicating that yes, this is in fact illuminated. It's just at a value that's much less than the ambient lighting surrounding it. In other words, it's compressed. And taking a look, we can obviously tell that we have glass doors, roll-up doors, and you can clearly see the reflections on here. Now that being said, with something like our pit buildings, we're probably not going to have glass doors on the front of our pit buildings, and they're just going to be open. You may have a roll-up door that's lifted up, but other than that, you're not going to have a big fat glass door. You're going to have an open bay, and the same results apply. So how do we want to show those? We don't want to show them as big, deep, dark holes. We want to have, again, subdued lighting inside. And what we're trying to do is, let's say we have a car in there, we want to have some reflections and hot spots off the car that's in there to further indicate the illusion that the building is in fact illuminated, and to indicate that without flooding it with a bunch of light. And that's a balancing game that very often takes place, trying to work things through. And what that tells me, for the most part, a single bright point light source is not going to be what we want to use, and we probably don't want to use incandescent. Commercial buildings are almost generally lit with fluorescent lighting, and so I'll probably want to use smaller, cool white LEDs. And the reason why I would rather use a handful of smaller LEDs versus one large LED or incandescent bulb is you can drive these smaller LEDs brighter and get more light out of them, but since it's so small, it's not going to project a lot of light, and you can keep your color more where it needs to be, and you can get more even lighting, even though the intensity of that lighting is subdued. You can still uniformly light the inside of a structure using an array of smaller LEDs. And incandescent bulbs are even more difficult to work with because as you underdrive them with voltage or current, the color changes drastically. And you go from a whiter light to a very, very super warm white as you underdrive them. And that also is not the look we want to achieve. For a commercial building using fluorescent lights, we want to have multiple LEDs mounted on the ceiling driving this lighting, and the overall effect will be a subdued value of lighting, but the color and the uniformity will indicate brighter light, even though it's not pouring a bunch of light out. Okay, let's take a look at this picture here, and I love this picture actually because these are the type of pit buildings I'm going to be building on my layout, and I believe that these are the Royal models that were available. I don't think they're still available. And if memory serves me, they were resin models pre-assembled, ready to go. And they were pre-lighted and everything. So let's take a look and see exactly what it is we do have here. If we look at the scene as a whole, and this would be a night scene obviously, you can see that the color and the overall brightness of the pit bays themselves seem to be adequate. It seems to be a good uniform lighting. It'll kind of give us the look we want, and it doesn't look out of place. That's the overall effect of what we're trying to do. Make sure something doesn't look necessarily out of place. And if we notice, we also have some gantry lighting on top of these gantries that hold the fuel hoses and whatnot. Very good effect, and that does a great job of tying this scene together. What else do we notice about this scene? Well, first off, if we look at the picture for what it is, there's no real additional lighting outside of the lighting we're seeing for the headlights of the cars going by. There's no additional flood lighting that you would normally find in these type of areas. So having some additional lighting, street lighting, flood lighting, anything like that to kind of provide a soft illumination to the entire scene itself would probably be a must. Right now it looks like you've got a pit building out in the middle of nowhere, and the only thing that's lit are the pit bays and the gantry lights, and that's it. Nothing else is illuminated. So we got some issues that we would want to work through to bring this scene into more of a realistic perspective. And remember, one of the rules talking about things that probably should be illuminated but are not can be a problem. If we look on top here and we see the VIP boxes, all these are, I don't even think you can illuminate them on these structures. I think this is a resin structure, and this is not transparent up here. But these areas up here would be prime candidates of that, and something that actually does need to be illuminated. That can really help bring the rest of the scene to life. And if you've got the illumination at the correct level and in the proper locations, you could have some figures close by the windows that would almost be presented in shadow because the interior lighting would be behind them. Likewise, other figures deeper into the structure, the lighting would probably be at them or in front of them, and it would kind of highlight those. So it would give that illusion of depth and 3D that you want to achieve, and present that as well. And that's going to actually be important on my layout, because these types of pit buildings are going to be, the main focus are going to be right here in front of the main portion of the layout. So these elements here are going to become very important, and that's why I chose these type of structures, because a lot of activity can be implied simply because there's a lot going on visually within this scene, and that can be you know, tweaked in and dialed in and generally give you a really good look overall. So make sure you don't miss any key lighting points, like in this case here. That's a biggie right there, and no ambient lighting for the rest of the scene. Other than that, the scene I think is pretty well executed. Okay, we're going to take a look at yet another building here, and this is a manufactured kit. It's not even a kit, it's fully pre-assembled, pre-lighted, everything. It comes just as you see here, and I believe they're available both in HO and O scale. And this is not a building I'm going to be putting on my layout at all, but you know, somebody may. But this does provide a good example here of what I think is acceptable lighting, and some things which are questionable, and some stuff that I would probably do different. First off, if we pay attention to the main window here, really good look, really good detailed. The lighting is about 6000 K, which is about the color you want to emulate fluorescent lighting. It's a good look. It's not overly blue. It looks really nice. The level of the lighting, it looks okay here. It's going to be hard to tell until you actually get it on your layout and you can determine the brightness for both day and night. And that being said, given the state of the tremendous compression in the lighting that we're emulating for the room to simulate day and night and reality versus day and night, it's almost implied, certainly not out of the question, that you may have to have different lighting values for day and night scenarios on your layouts. So that's something to be mindful of. But from this as it stands, the lighting Okay, I would probably leave this about where it is, given the ambient room lighting, and work from there. I don't feel like anything would have to be adjusted too terribly much in this regard. The overhead signs, I'm not a big fan of. They look okay, but in this type of lighting that we're looking at the model as a whole, they might be overdriven and overly bright at this point, and there's probably too much of a bluish hint to it, and it really just doesn't look overly realistic. I would probably prefer to have a non-illuminated sign and have maybe gooseneck lights or something further providing some ambient illumination on top of the sign, and I think that would look a lot better. But this is what it is, and lights are cool, and if you want to go ahead and use lights like this as you have them provided, by all means knock yourself out. But eventually you'll see what I'm talking about, how they can provide an unrealistic look sometimes under certain daylighting conditions. One of the big things we notice, you remember one of the first things I talked about is some of the things you want to avoid. And in this case here, we have a big display window that's not illuminated. And you know, really this sticks out like a sore thumb to me. And the reason why it's not illuminated is, of course, we've got our lighting inside the structure. And this is probably another wall that's set back maybe 1/8 of an inch from the glass to provide some depth. And it's blocking off the light coming from the rest of the inside of the building. And here's a good example of where we have the potential for really creating a nice scene out of this. And when I first saw this, I thought to myself, okay, what would I do with this? How would I fix this? And I would probably run 2 additional LEDs, very small, or maybe one in the middle that's a little bit larger. And I would drive them using a circuit that would emulate the flicker of a fluorescent bulb that's going bad. And put that in the display window. Now we have this window that's kind of in and out, flickering on and off. And at that point, the simple addition of some additional signage on your windows, something that says going out of business sale, you couple that with a flickering light in your main display window, you just completely told a different story from what's being shown here. And that's a good way how a simple lighting effect and some additional signage can totally change the feel of something you're looking at. So don't be afraid to experiment with different lighting effects. I would be cautious about overdoing them. And generally, if you think something like the scope of a model railroad, you've got a town area, you may have 15 buildings in that town area. That being said, if you've got this scenario that I mentioned where you have one or two bulbs inside this display window that are flickering, that's fine. You can put this on your layout with no problem whatsoever. If you have a second scenario where you have flickering lights inside your windows, that's going to be one too many. And so especially when we're dealing with lighting effects, we want to minimize them because in reality they are the exception, not the rule. And we have tendencies to want to overdo them because they're cool, but it's really easy to overdo them. And usually I like to keep one within any point of view. And any more than that, it's too much. So this would be a great candidate here for adding some flickering lights and a going out of business sign. And that tells, again, a completely different story from what's presented here. Okay, so we'll wrap this episode up and we'll stop this one here. We'll continue with part 2 in the next episode, and that will be reserved for residential structures. This was primarily focused on the commercial structures, and let's go over our list of don'ts, I guess, our initial rules that we want to make sure we've got covered. You want to avoid any sort of light leaks between the joints of your buildings, be it the ceiling, be it the walls, or being at the base where the building meets the ground. Those need to be completely avoided. We want to make sure we don't have any glowing walls or hot spots. If we do, paint the insides black and then paint over again with a lighter neutral color, a beige, a light beige, a light gray, and that'll eliminate that light bleed through your structures or your roof, to be precise. We want to avoid any sort of artificial, unrealistic scenarios where things that should be lit are not lit, and vice versa. Things you normally wouldn't illuminate are now illuminated, and those we need to kind of watch out for and make sure we've got those covered. We want to make sure we don't overlight our structures and have the lighting so bright it looks way out of place. And we need to make sure that we don't have direct visibility of our point light source when viewing from a casual angle, because that, again, is a complete scene annihilator itself. That will completely destroy the look of the scene as a whole. So these are just some basic stuff and some basic examples of how commercial structures are handled. They should be illuminated anytime they're open for business. They're illuminated on the inside without any regard for time of day. If you have a difficult time trying to get effective illumination on the structure during daylight, you're better off not illuminating it. And that's very important, because what are we going after? We're going after the reflections, the highlights, and the contrast that show up in the windows themselves. That's what we're going after. The building should look relatively dark compared to your ambient light during daylight conditions. Likewise at night, you want to make sure it's not ridiculously bright where it looks like you have a million spotlights in there, but give a reasonable balance to your ambient lighting conditions, and that's going to be pretty much different for everybody. So we'll wrap this episode up. Again, I hope everybody had a great Thanksgiving, and stay tuned for episode 21. And in that episode, we're going to dive through residential, because like I say, it behaves completely different than commercial. We'll do the same thing. We'll take some examples and we'll move on from there. So again, thank you everybody for watching. I thank you for the subscriptions and the likes and the comments. It means a lot to me. I want everybody to have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.